to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here with Bill Schofield and John Harrigan. Howdy, guys. How are you?
Good. Doing well, man.
Awesome. So what have you guys been reading recently? Anything exciting? Anything cool? This seemed to be a pretty good question. You guys enjoyed answering a couple weeks ago, and I think maybe our listeners would like to hear it again. So what you reading today? John?
Yeah, it's the perfect nerd question. I appreciate it. You could ask it every week, and it would go over great. It would solve our awkward pleasantries issue. So I vote for this question.
I second that. And we are a majority, Josh.
Well, we'll have to see what our listeners say since they're the majority in our midst as well.
Yeah, so I was reading this morning, an article that Matt Thiessen wrote a few years ago, kind of a tribute to Ed Sanders on Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and just kind of talking about how his book was kind of watershed and the movement of putting Paul within the context of first century Judaism. And
nice.
It's a great article.
Yeah.
Nice. How about you, Bill?
Well, I've been split. So I've been reading some Anders Runeson, Inventing Christian Identity. Same time I've had another eye on a lot of primary sources. Been reading a lot of ancient Roman commentary on Jewish identity and later Christian identity for some writing that I'm doing. So very good stuff. Helps to really give you a real comprehensive picture of what was going on the ground. I enjoy it.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, I guess I'll throw in what I'm going through actually with a couple of other disciples here. I've gone back to something I picked up a while ago and then just started to go through again with a couple of disciples, which is Mind the Gap by Matthias Henze. Just a simple little volume to talk about the importance of Second Temple literature to understanding the world of Jesus and the world of the New Testament. So really amazing little book. Highly recommend that as well. So, well, great. Really cool. Listeners, thanks again for joining us for another episode of our show. We've got another interview this week that we hope will be encouraging and provoking to you, really, because in the second season, we purposely brought on guests that, all the guests you've heard, really to encourage you not only to stay the course with this apocalyptic gospel, but to stir you to be bold and clear about the cross, the return of Jesus, the day of the Lord, and the age to come, really all as a first century Jew would have understood it. So on today's show, we have not one, but two very special guests. We have Stephanie Quick and we have Devon Phillips with us. Stephanie is a writer and producer serving with Frontier Alliance International, and she lives in the Golan Heights and co-hosts the Better Beautiful podcast with Jeff Henderson. Highly recommend that podcast. Y'all should definitely check it out. And Devon Phillips is just a pilgrim longing for the day of the Lord and the revealing of the sons of God and the redemption of our bodies. And she's privileged as well to serve in the Middle East with Frontier Alliance International and contributes regularly to The Wire. So ladies, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for having us. It's an honor.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. First, let me say, listeners, if you have not yet connected with Frontier Alliance International in some way, then you really should. You're missing out. Earlier this season, we had FAI's founder and president, Dalton Thomas, on the show, and that was a great interview with him. But ladies, great to have you today. I mean, I think we've been joking a little bit that our interviews this season have mostly been a dudes club, and so it's definitely cool to have some really rooted and grounded ladies on the show that can encourage our other female listeners as well. And I mean everyone, not just our other female listeners. So it's great to have you. So why don't we begin? And why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself? Like, you're in the Middle East. What are you doing? Tell us a little bit of your story.
As you said earlier, Josh, I am field personnel for Frontier Alliance International. If you are just catching up with who Frontier Alliance International is, they're a missions organization focused on reaching unreached people groups, mostly in the Middle East. And they have the kind of extra distinction of having the urgency of the day of the Lord connected with the Great Commission and the centrality of Israel in the gospel message. And so I've been with Frontier Alliance International, FAI, as we call it, for about 5 years now. And most of those 5 years have been spent in Jordan and Israel. And tucked in between those two times, I was in Iraq and Syria for a short while. So those were shorter stints, but very impactful. And so that brings me here to today.
Wow.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Tell us just a little bit, like what is it like in the Middle East? I mean, I guess our Western listeners may think, oh, wow, bombs dropping everywhere, crazy stuff that all of the mainstream media reports. I know that, for instance, Stephanie, you told us earlier, you're in a bomb shelter, right? And it seems like every house in the Middle East is typical to have a bomb shelter. Like, all the houses I grew up in the northeastern part of the U.S. had a basement. Here in Texas, no houses have a basement. Is that
Right.
kind of a normal thing? And what is it like there living in the Middle East?
Very normative. Every house, there's probably a year that's kind of the line of demarcation. Every house is built with one. If it's older, or if it's like an old apartment complex or something in Tel Aviv, or more congested areas in the cities, they've got community bomb shelters, or every block is assigned to this. These houses go to this one, or you just kind of know, when things were going down with Hamas in May, the last war, I had friends I went down to Tel Aviv, I think in June, and we were going through the streets grabbing food, and they were like, oh yeah, there's right down that little alley there, that's we hid in that bomb shelter for a while because there were, rockets and things going overhead. And so, I think when I was living in Kurdistan, these were the ISIS years, and so we were an hour and a half or so up the road from the seat of the caliphate, and I remember getting, if you guys have traveled in and around the region at all, you get very thorough searches for vests or belts or something, and going to Kurdistan upped the ante on it, because I couldn't go grocery shopping without getting a more thorough search than I would get if I were going to the airport. And, I think you just, at first it's a little bit like, I get it, I support it, I'm in favor of security measures. But it took a little bit of getting used to, and then you just get used to it, So, but, the bomb shelter now is my little office cave. It's a really convenient space to have. For sure. Wow. Yeah, I just suspect that is so foreign to so many of our Western listeners, and how it's become so normative there in the Middle East. And it really, I think in many ways, indicates just the volatility of the atmosphere there in the Middle East compared to life for the normal American, normal Westerner. Well, yeah, volatility, but I think also a willingness to accept it. Yeah, really good point.
Yeah,
good point.
Absolutely. I also think too that when you are kind of surrounded by conflict, you get to a point where you have to continue with normal life. You can't let it control what decisions you make, or where you go, or where you live. And so, and it's even a known fact within Israel that if you want people to be less traumatized by the conflict, you continue life as normal as much as possible. So we had friends that were going to university in Tel Aviv while bombs were falling, and they thought, surely you would cancel classes, but they were not. So it's a different way of thinking for sure. But it's also a lot of people, if they haven't lived in conflict zones or near to conflict zones, don't understand how localized it is. So until your grocery store is the one that got bombed, which happened to us a month or so ago, where a grocery store we normally go to had a bomb fall about 100, 200 meters from it. It doesn't affect you at all. I mean, everything is almost the same as it would be, with the exceptions of what Stephanie was talking about in terms of extra security. But it affects your life, I think, a lot less than many people would assume if they haven't lived in a conflict zone.
Yeah, that is so utterly different from the average Westerner's thought about life, and even what goes on in the Middle East from what Western media sources report and things like that. So it's really cool to hear from people who are actually there, kind of in the midst of all of this. So Yeah. Well, Devon, thanks for sharing. Stephanie, why don't you share a little bit about your story as well? Like, what brought you to the Middle East? What are you doing there in particular? And yeah, tell us a little bit of your story.
Well, my like party line is that I'm the military brat middle child of Midwestern Catholics. And I feel like if you're familiar with those demographics, you have my number. And I grew up in and around church culture, Bible culture. Before I really knew the Lord, I knew that the Lord was real. I knew that Jesus was God, and, whatever the implications of that might be, I just thought I was under the thumb. And said the prayer in junior high, started going to a youth group in high school, and had, really sincere faith, but I would call it youth group faith. That's very easily shaken, very easily sifted. And when I was in college, I was, on one hand, like I said, I had this gut level conviction that Jesus was God and he was real. But I was also like, this Buddhism thing is like algebra. X plus Y is Z. You get what you put in, you lose what you don't. And it costs me significantly less. I could just go this path, but the Lord was very gently barring me from going completely wayward. And while I was in college, and I would say I went to the college that I went to because it was in Jacksonville, Florida, and it put me under the pastoral. It put me in proximity to the church that I really grew in grace in, under the pastoral care of Jeff Henderson, who is now director of FAI, and he and I co-host the Better Beautiful together. But it was in college that my first conversation with Jeff was like getting smacked upside the head with a 2x4 that is grace. And it took me like 2 years to really regather my footing and come to terms with that. And by the time I got out of college, because I'd been thinking, man, if Jesus is who he says that he is, and if he treats me and relates to me the way that he says that he does in terms of grace, in terms of mercy, it defies all of these kind of mathematical presuppositions of something like Buddhism and karma and whatever. It flips everything on its head, and it forces you to get to know the character of God. And so I got out of college and I went and did a 6-month internship at the House of Prayer in Kansas City, and there got connected to some folks who were running a prayer and missions base in the South Pacific, and that's where I met Dalton and Anna. So for a long time, leaving college, that whole journey, knew that the Lord had given me a pretty profound vision for media messaging and leveraging media to disciple people into affection for and allegiance to Jesus. And this is the language that I have now. I didn't have that language then. But, in my early 20s, I really committed myself to getting to know the Lord and carving out a depth in the Word and a life in prayer, and thought, this will set me on the path that I want to be in 10 years or 20 years or whatever. And really got I'm not even sure what the word would be. When I met Jesus, I was like, man, if you were kind, that changes everything. Because I grew up thinking you weren't. And then, and you kind of know Jesus is coming back. And then I started to get clarity and conviction on the return of the Lord and all of the things that are connected to that. And I thought, man, that really changes everything. And I had already had this sense of urgency in my bones, but it gave clarity to that sense of urgency. And so, when Dalton and Anna felt the Lord sending them off to the Middle East, I was like, better y'all than me. I took him to the airport, kissed him goodbye, put him on a plane, thinking I'm going to go back to the States and start a missional media production company. And, not long thereafter, before I got on the flight out of New Zealand, I thought, well, I sent Dalton an email and said, what if we do a film on the issue and theology of Israel? Because, I was thinking of that Tozer quote, like, whatever comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And if you think something that's not true of God, it doesn't matter if you have the good intentions, it's still false. It's still idolatrous, and it'll still kill you somehow. And I think that Israel is the tripwire for true knowledge of God. So it wasn't that I didn't get into it because I was like, I didn't have a heart for Israel in a profound way. I super didn't have a heart for the nations, but I had a burden that we would know God rightly, that I would know God rightly. And if we could remove different stumbling blocks, let's do that. And so I ended up following them out. I was plant team day one, FAI. That was 10 years ago, and here we are. And that, what was going to be a single documentary has grown into this thing. We realized that film is one of the most effective storytelling mechanisms of the day. And, here we are.
Yeah, that's awesome, Stephanie. I just want to encourage listeners to get in on you and Jeff's podcast. I've known Jeff for many years, and we were on a board together at a missions agency in Wilmore around Asbury, and Jeff's just such an awesome guy. He's kind of a big kid, but such a heart for the Lord and authenticity. He's just awesome. But y'all's podcast I've really enjoyed too, particularly the Philippians 2, your recent discussions on that,
cool.
Particularly the Day of the Lord one.
That's all Jeff. Awesome. I'm just the MC.
All right, nice. So
awesome.
Anyway, just wanted to give a plug for that. It's really great.
Yeah, the Better Beautiful. Find it anywhere. The Better Beautiful.
Ladies, that's great. I have a question. Maybe Devon, let's start with you. So how has then, putting kind of your story and that timeline together, how would you explain how the gospel, or the gospel of, like you said, the coming kingdom, how has it really impacted your life personally and the trajectory of where you're going? Wow.
I mean, there's nothing in my life that's affected the trajectory of where I'm going more, of course, than the gospel. I think to give a good answer, I would probably have to go back in time a little bit. So I'll rewind. I come from a believing family. Thank God. I'm really grateful for that. And I have a missions heritage. So my grandparents were missionaries in East Africa and Kenya. My grandfather taught at Scott Theological Seminary in Machakos. And John, I heard John talking about RVA a few episodes ago. So that's where a lot of my family went to school. So I was pretty excited, the RVA connection.
His oldest goes there.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a heritage and a kind of understanding in my family that I don't think is very normal. When I listen to colleagues and they're saying our family's having trouble with us being overseas and our family's having trouble with what motivates us to be here, it's been wonderful for me that that's actually not been something that I've had to explain or work through. But on that same token, I'm from kind of a Reformed evangelical background. So it's cut off from a lot of the apocalyptic gospel as you described it and unpacked it in the first season. And so it's really interesting for me to go back and see the seeds that the Lord planted very early on and how he prepared me for this message, and then how he's challenged me to kind of take this message out. So I even remember sitting on my grandfather's lap, probably 3 or so. And I, praise God, had a Sunday school teacher who loved to preach the gospel to infants. And so at the ripe old age of 2.5, I think I prayed the prayer of acceptance and of asking Jesus to be in my heart, as they would put it for the children's ministry there. And I remember sitting with my grandfather and him talking to me about Israel at the age of 3, I think, and just saying, there's such a thing as election, and there's such a thing as chosenness, and God's not done with Israel. But that put something in me for sure, but it was very vague for most of my life. I had a vague theological sense about the centrality of Israel, and it was planted by my grandfather and then watered by my father, who was an Old Testament major in his studies and things like that. But if you ask them to make a really cogent biblical argument about it, they can pull some from the prophets and things like that, but it can't quite hang together. There's a missing element to the whole thing. And so I think that I can trace the Lord growing that Israel component from a young age. But it wasn't until I actually came to the Middle East and started doing training with FAI, where I had somebody hand me the Gospel of Christ Crucified. I had somebody hand me When a Jew Rules the World. I had somebody hand me Islamic Antichrist. And I started understanding where the missing pieces were for me in this gospel of the kingdom. And it was such, it could be like a cartoon where the light goes on above your head, because I just remember reading the Bible. You're meant to read the whole Bible, right? And you're meant to get through it every year if you're a good evangelical believer. And so much of it seemed so completely irrelevant or just ununderstandable. And you're saying, has this prophetic passage happened already, or hasn't happened already? Was it about a historical event that I'm just ignorant about? Why do I have to slog through these genealogies? Why do I have to go through the law? Why is John in the beginning of the Gospels preaching the gospel when the cross hasn't even happened yet? There's just so much in the Bible that wasn't that I couldn't connect, and I couldn't trace the threads through. That when the covenants and the centrality of Israel and God's covenants with her, and the day of the Lord, when those two elements fell into place, the Bible just became technicolor for me, and my ability to communicate the gospel and the hope that we have just took off.
That's great. That's great. I appreciate that. Stephanie, same question. How you mentioned actually in your story, kind of when the return of Jesus came into focus for you as a part of your story. How did that affect you and the trajectory of your life?
This is going to sound completely off topic, but it'll land, I hope. But when I was in college, I was working at a Starbucks for the last 3 or 4 semesters of my time in college, feeling very assigned to that store and that team by the Lord. One of my roommates had been working there at first, and then she was transferring out of state, and kind of greased the wheel so I could take over and get her job as a strategic. Really, she wanted to keep a witness in that store, and it's a very unique culture. So the Lord was kind of priming me for creative access things, and well before I was thinking about it at all. And I remember, sometime in my internship in Kansas City, and I cannot express my gratitude to that house enough, just to create an environment and a greenhouse where I could just sit and saturate in the Word and in prayer, and the Lord could really speak really clearly. Not to say that, my time in Kansas City was a helpful season. But I remember being in sitting in my apartment one night, realizing I had not told all of my coworkers in Starbucks the full gospel. I had told them part of it. And I didn't feel condemnation from the Lord, you're accountable to what you know, and I told them what I knew. But it was stake in the ground moment for me that moving forward to bear a faithful witness meant to bear a full witness. And that's why I love having the phrase Maranatha at our disposal, because it binds those things together. If he came once and atoned, broke the power of sin and death, I love that and I'm grateful for it, but now what? And if he's coming again to rule and reign and restore all things, but he didn't come the first time to break the power of sin and death and take on the due punishment for sin in his own flesh, then to say that I am screwed is to put it lightly. So I said, I don't mean this in a heroic way. I've certainly also regretted saying this, but I was like, Lord, put me wherever, send me, like, you lead, I follow. Not so much as out of an eagerness to go traipse around the world, but just because I had this visceral sense of urgency, and I didn't want to be, 50 years old and look back with regret, or 80 years old and look back with regret. And I don't want to stand before the Lord and say, you gave me opportunities to serve you. You gave me opportunities to, quote, shatter my alabaster. And I chose comfort instead. I chose to keep the oil in the alabaster. I just didn't want that to be my story. And that's grounded so much in the return of the Lord and the day of the Lord, because, I am convinced I will stand before him. And when he comes, he brings reward. So whatever it is that I do now, if it's valuable to him, there's ice cream for it in the age to come. And I want all of the ice cream.
Awesome. So you must be an ice cream person. That's the carrot.
Yeah, mint chocolate chip. And I just want to go on record saying it's very difficult to find in the Middle East. They'll lay out pistachio and trick you, and then you find out it is painful.
It is painfully.
In like the hottest, it's hot here.
It's painful that you cannot find good ice cream, particularly mint chocolate chip. I just want to testify to this.
Yeah. Wow.
I just want to throw in that Middle Easterners think eating mint as a sweet is generally gross. It's like if you made something with parsley, because I've put out for different, like a Christmas party, peppermint bark and things like that. Oof, I heard about that I still hear about it.
It is a different brand of mint, though. That's a different mint.
Yeah, it's a different mint. They don't like any sweet mint. They don't.
Well, we bring good news.
Good to know.
That is weird.
Yeah, ice cream in general in the Middle East is messed up. A lot of times it's grainy. It has all kinds of funny textures. It's a mess.
Man.
There are a few things you look at it and you're like, what are the cultural undergirdings that made you think this was an okay thing to execute? That's one of them.
Love it. Wow.
That's awesome. Why don't you guys talk to us a little bit of how kind of Jewish eschatology and Jewish election affect life and ministry in the Middle East? Because there's lots of dynamics around that particularly.
There are lots of dynamics around that.
It's a very dynamic.
Yeah.
It's a very dynamic. If you would like to talk about the dynamic.
You have some different parties. Like, I've been in the Arab world, the Turkish world, now living in northern Israel in the Jewish world. The thing that outside of the borders here, generally speaking, outside of the borders here, the immediate thing you're going to come up against is offense, which is, if I were at my Starbucks in the States, I would bump up against offense, because I think the human heart is engineered in a way that we are best sifted by covenant, and thus we have what we have, So Israel's, on one hand, the covenantal peculiarity of Israel through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a stumbling block to the nations, but it's also its own unique tripwire to the sons and daughters of Jacob. And outside of that family lineage, there's this immediate, like, what makes them so special? Nothing really, except that God chose them. Well, why did God choose them? And, what are the implications or ramifications of that? Or no, you're just, it's not that God, it's everything's through Ishmael. And then so you have the general, I think, Gentile capitulation against the covenant enmeshed with Islamic rage, which is a very unique thing. And then, here there's there's the running joke that if you get two Jews in a room, you have three opinions. And I would say that's putting it lightly. So, I have some friends who are like, this is our box, this is you guys' box as Christians, and you do you, and we'll do us, and that's cool, but whatever. And then there are others who are like, yeah, but it's almost like Fiddler on the Roof, like looking up the sky, like, could you choose anybody else for a minute? Like, what is the big deal, and how has it helped us? Because I think it's only hurt us, and I would agree and say it is a burden to bear, for sure. And I think of a conversation that I had a few years ago out by the Western Wall when we were filming, I think it was Covenant 2 or 3, and, we stripped our camera rigs down to be as nimble and small as possible, just because we were going to be going through some sensitive areas, and we didn't want to freak people out, because if you've got a big rig or like a big camera, they think you're BBC and they don't trust you or whatever. And we're just, and this mom had come up with her two daughters who were like high school age, and pulled our DP aside and started asking him questions. He pulled me over to fill things in, and what's going on, what are you guys filming? And I said, well, we're working on a project called Covenant and Controversy. She just cut me off. She goes, are you Jewish? And I said, no. And she goes, then you don't have a covenant, and stormed off. And her kids were mortified, like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, if she'd given me the time of day, I would have said, no, I know that, and I'm not here to say what's yours is mine. I do think that there are questions that I would ask through the testimony of the prophets. If the knowledge of the glory of the Lord is going to cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, if all nations are going to be blessed through Abraham, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then how is that going to happen if we don't hear about him? And when we do hear about him, what is that going to demand of us? What does it look like to bow the knee to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? But I think it's, I far be it from me to tell a Jewish person how they have to steward these things, but it's clear to me that they have to reckon with the fact that there is a covenantal peculiarity. You are accountable to what you have been given, and they will be held to account for how they've stewarded, all the things that Paul rattles off in Romans. But also for us to submit to that place of peculiarity and say we are grafted in, and now we'll lock arms with you and believe. Love believes all things, endures all things, and hopes for the best. We'll love you well, Jacob. And though I think the testimony of Scripture is that Jacob's trouble is yet future and will greet us, that'll be our threshold into the Messianic reign. In the words of Reggie Kelly, Jacob's trouble is not only Jacob's problem, and we'll ride the storm out with you. We're not going anywhere. And this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up. But I have had a number of conversations with Jewish, some Messianic believers, and some completely secular, and still quite scarred from what their family endured half a century, like in the Holocaust. Had Christian communities, Christian friends, and where were they when the train started rolling? They were gone, so there's a wow. Self-preservation thing. So across the spectrum, I've had this same conversation where they're like, yeah, that's cool that you evangelicals are so stoked that we're back in the land, but everybody knows you're only stoked that we're back in the land because you think 2/3 of us are going to get slaughtered and you can go get raptured to go play harps in the clouds. Thanks a lot. I would actually prefer you not be here. Just call it what it is. You're more anti-Semitic than the next guy. Right? So we as evangelicals, we as Gentile Christians, disciples of Jesus, have to... my dog is dreaming behind me. I don't know if you'll hear the kind of whimper dream barks. But I have never propagated that message. I've never done anything to support that message, but that's my family. Those are all my cousins, so we have to take responsibility for that and accountability for that and start to recalibrate to the gospel in our own households and congregations. So I really appreciate what you guys are doing with this podcast to recalibrate us back to, the way north, because it grieves me and it angers me that the testimony that's actually reaching Jewish people in Israel right now is, cool, bro, get slaughtered. I just want to go play harps on the clouds.
Yeah, I think dispensationalism opened a lot of doors to evangelicals, at least considering Israel. I think dispensationalism has had a lot of positive effects, but also has a lot of negative effects and some strange ideas that a first century Jew would shake his head at. But everything ends up bearing fruit over generations, not over years.
Gosh, what Stephanie said is so good and so true. As she's talking, I can think of 5 stories for each example she's giving. But even maybe slightly as a counterbalance to what Stephanie said is, yes, in Israel, there's almost more offense at election than even in the Arab world sometimes. But what's really, really interesting, maybe less from the election side and more from the apocalyptic side, is everyone's apocalyptic. And so you have completely secular Jewish friends that we have that are totally willing for us to have a talk about signs of the times. And they might say, hey, everything you've said about this gospel sounds really good, but my life is comfortable. I have what I want. I have the family I want. I have the job I want. I'm relatively secure. I'm doing a job, that I like. And I just don't want to change that. And you can press in at that point, but then you can say, you know what? Let's go to Matthew 24. Let's go and let's look at some of the signs. If you see those things, run. If you hear these things, go. Be part of the group at the very least that looks upon the one you've pierced and mourns because you know what's going on right now. And so that's been something within kind of the Jewish framework that's been really helpful. And it's so surprising who has a grid for this. Stephanie and I also have a really good friend, completely secular, fairly, it's hard to pinpoint politically. There's not really political equivalence in U.S. political spectrum in Israel, but he'll say things like, we should give back, most of Jerusalem or all of Jerusalem. He doesn't care, about, the Jewish state having Jerusalem, basically. But he and his family live in the north. And the reason why they live in the north is because of the battle of Gog and Magog. He wants to be in. He wants to be there to fight. And he does not believe in any of the scriptures. He does not believe in Jerusalem. He doesn't believe in any of those things, but he knows within himself, as being part of the security apparatus of Israel for so long, that it's not a question of if, but when. And so there's this really unique way of the apocalyptic gospel being applicable in the land. But it's also applicable to the Muslim inhabitants of the Middle East as well, because Islam is profoundly apocalyptic. You can even see, most of the caliphate movement throughout history, but particularly in modern time, ISIS and even the Taliban, they make constant apocalyptic appeals to Muslims across the world. And they have a powerful pull on adherents of Islam. And so a very, I don't want to say non-confrontational because it is confrontational in some ways, but Muslims are almost always happy to have conversations about the end of the age. And so having that, not being afraid to broach that subject, or treating eschatology as a maybe extra credit, or not really salvific, or any of those kind of things, you get freedom from that mindset to be able to approach gospel topics within Islam and within Judaism with the day of the Lord firmly in mind.
Yeah, it's a strange dynamic, Devon, where the Muslims are. It's kind of it's canonized within Islamic thought, the apocalyptic framework of history and two ages and the day of God and the judgment, and devout Muslims are stirring on it 24/7. But it's a little bit of the dynamic where apocalyptic has made headway into modern New Testament studies and even modern evangelicalism, but not Jewish apocalyptic. And so there's a reception of apocalyptic thought, but Jewish election's just completely off the table is even an option. And a few weeks ago, I spoke at our team meeting. We're just working through, the epistles, and I got assigned 2 Corinthians 9. So I was just talking about the Jerusalem collection and the dynamics behind the Jerusalem collection and the intensity of it, and how Paul was taking this intentional collection over a year's time from all the different Gentile congregations and what went into that. And I was just kind of working through Romans 15 some, and how Paul's statement that the Gentiles owe it to the Jews, and that it was really theologically driven why the Jerusalem collection was happening. And that the reason you have a wind in the House of Islam, thousands of churches throughout the Middle East and Arab world, but there is absolutely, I couldn't verify it, but I would say not one Arab congregation that is intentionally taking offerings for messianic ministries in Israel, because there's no theological context for it. And I just kind of got that deadpan stare at me by the end of it. And I was talking to an Egyptian believer who was with us, and I asked him, what would it take for this particular church here, an Arab church, to take an intentional offering to send it to Messianic believers in Israel. And he just stared at me and he said, "It's beyond impossible. It could never, ever, ever happen. It's beyond impossible." And so over the last 2 weeks, I've just had that phrase echoing in my mind, beyond impossible. Beyond the history, the theology, all the dynamics in the Middle East that make it beyond impossible for Arabs to receive the reality of Jewish election. It's pretty intense.
Wow.
Well, on that note, I have another question here. What are specifically, given some of those dynamics and the complications surrounding the gospel message and Jewish election and how it relates to apocalyptic expectation, and just living that out in the Middle East and even in the land of Israel, what are some of the challenges that you guys have faced there specifically in terms of the gospel?
Sure. On the one hand, I was just saying we were freed in a lot of ways by this gospel message. I think one of the major difficulties around the apocalyptic gospel, the gospel of the kingdom, is there's a lot of suspicion around it in groups of believers because it's not a majority view. I've actually had the real privilege of being able to take some university classes on Jewish-Christian relations and the parting of ways and things like that. And it's this year, it's just been driven home again and again in the books that I'm reading, in the papers that I'm reading, that the by and far standard Christian understanding of what a Christian position would be in terms of the relationship of Israel and the church would be supersessionism, almost across the board. It's just a given, even in Jewish circles. And so when you say, no.
Jewish apologists define the difference between Judaism and Christianity along the lines of realized eschatology and supersessionism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so when you come and say something different, they think you're unorthodox.
Yeah, they think you're playing some kind of trick, trickster thing going
tricky. On. Yeah. And so I think that's probably both, as you were saying, John, earlier with believing communities, when you try and bring these teachings up, these concepts up, there's a lot of suspicion because it isn't the party line, so to speak. And then when you bring it up to, Jewish scholars or unbelievers or people who have familiarity with Christian positions on these things, they'll say, no one believes what you're saying. You are a complete anomaly. And maybe what you're saying sounds good.
Strange. We've never heard any of that.
Yeah, we're pretty much immune to all of that.
So it must be a Middle Eastern.
I'm sure you've never heard it before. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges, or you being accused of, okay, you're just caught up in semantics here. You're defining these words this way. We're defining these words that way. It's not really a big deal. It doesn't really change anything. And I think those two things are kind of the main issues that I think come up with maybe people with Jewish background or people with a Christian background or Messianic believers. But I also think with unbelievers, there is this just complete inability to connect with all the ways, all of the implications, all of the costliness of the gospel. As I was saying, we have friends who will say, sounds great, sounds right, sounds true, but I'm comfortable. Or if they're, in a conflict zone and they're not comfortable, which actually is, fertile ground for the gospel because of that. But they'll say, I've already invested too much in this other ideology for me to switch gears. I think particularly in Islam, and particularly in relationship with Israel. So you can tell people, God chose Israel. God made covenants with Israel. We relate to God through those covenants through Israel. And there's that extra level of offense beyond just the normal Gentile level of offense. There's the Islamic level of offense that you have to work through and break through to be able to get the truth internalized.
I'm thinking like any conversation I have with an Israeli, like a Jewish Israeli, if we're having a conversation about, getting into the meat of the gospel, the primary opposition that I encounter is, and this is just conversational, it's not like I'm not like walking around browbeating anybody with it, but it's, I think it's a condemnation of the Western community and the Christian theological and academic community that everybody here can see the writing on the wall that there's going to be a war in the north. If you don't think that Hezbollah and Iran, et cetera, are going to overrun the borders, you are either profoundly naive or you're not paying attention. And it will condemn you to watch these things take place while you're sipping your coffee in your classroom, or whatever, writing your book and chuckle, nobody believes what you're saying, but the writing is on the wall. Everybody here knows the writing is on the wall. So if I were to say to my neighbor, that, all of the nations round about are going to try to mow y'all down, they go, yeah, duh. And that's when Messiah comes. Obviously. Glad you're catching up to it. But if you say, what happens when Messiah comes, and because there's the element of like there's a very literal, this is the thing that makes us maybe a little bit niche, a very literal return of a very literal God-man in the flesh to liberate a very literal Jerusalem and a very literal nation state of Israel. And they all, I don't even want to dignify all of the rabbit trail, accusations that get lobbed against those positions. That's one thing. The other thing is the issue of righteousness and what the man's relationship to God. Why is he delivering? Why is there rage? Why are we here in this predicament to begin with? All of it boils down to everybody has fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody is in a troubled position with their maker, and Moses won't save you in that day, because in the Passover, for example, I asked a friend of mine, I said, if a Jewish household did not paint their doorpost in the blood of the lamb, what would have happened to them that night? And she said, well, they would have died. I said, they would have died. What would have happened if you were in the desert and you were bitten by the snake and afflicted and you didn't look to the snake that Moses was holding up? Well, you would have died. Right. So you have to, as silly or foolish or, simple as it may be, look to what the Lord is doing and bind your heart in belief. That's it. So if he said, I came once in the flesh to achieve this goal, this is my name, you can't get to the Father but through this doorway, that's all right, now listen, that I've had some people be like, that's pretty out of line. That's audacious, and I have another neighbor that's like, that's so cute that you guys, in a friendly way, we're really good friends. They were like, it's cool that you guys can, I really like having, these rooftop conversations with y'all at night under the stars, but you see kind of how wild it is that you have come here with these beliefs, and you're pretty brave because you're outnumbered, So I don't know where to fit that in the puzzle, but I think I would not have expected moving here and all of my neighbors going. It's like I flipped the script a bit. Before I came to the Middle East, and particularly before I came to Israel, I would be surrounded by people who would go, yeah, righteousness by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus, totally, but Israel doesn't matter, and that future stuff was all summed up in 70 AD or whatever. You have to go, oh my gosh, let's go line by line, because there are things that just weren't satisfied in 70 AD, and I'm starting to think you maybe just aren't reading it right, or at all. And then I come here, and they're like, yeah, totally, day of the Lord, totally roundabout nations, huge war, totally. But, that Jesus thing's kind of a crock. And I'm like,
wow,
the Lord will bring this, to the center.
Yeah, come on. Well, this is one of the things you said reminded me actually of something that was said on one of your recent Better Beautiful episodes, where I can't remember if it was you or Jeff that said it's one thing to be delivered from Egypt, but it's another thing to actually make it into the promised land, right? And so even that dynamic of both the coming of the Lord and affirming an apocalyptic gospel, but then lacking the Jesus point, the atonement and the Messiah and the cross and these realities. And, I think that leading us into our final question, I think that's a good lead in, because, it seems like the challenges that we as Westerners tend to face tend to be very different in a very polarizing way, or in a very, think of like a magnet, like the different sides of a magnet, and it's like north or south. Okay, well, the other side is what really stands up as challenges in the Middle East. So I'd like to ask this final question really in terms of what you face as challenges in the Middle East, and being Westerners yourselves in some sort of capacity now serving in the Middle East. I mean, I guess, Devon, you have a lot more Northern Africa and missional background in your life as well because of your family. But still, what are a few ways that you would challenge our listeners who maybe you're still deeply entrenched, because like I said earlier, I think a lot of our listeners are in the Western world and, are aware of what's going on in the Middle East. But from people who are in the Middle East, in the trenches, dealing with this on a daily basis, what are a couple of ways that you would challenge our listeners to stay the course with this gospel?
Well, what first comes to mind when you say this is a sermon that was given at my church when I was being commissioned and launched to the Middle East. And the pastor was talking about doing big, crazy things, like dramatic, crazy things for God, selling everything you have, going overseas, living by faith, all of those kind of things, and small, crazy things, the things that you do in your daily life that show that you're oriented to the day of the Lord, show that you're living for another age, show that you are not rooted and grounded in this life and in the present evil age. So when he came up to me afterwards, he goes, "Hey, there's Big Crazy," and I probably fully deserve that nickname. But as soon as he said it to me, I had this kind of sobriety wash over me. And I thought, if the Lord called me to the Middle East and I decided to stay in the US, that would be disastrous. Like, that would be crazy. That would be, and there's so much about living in the West that's so difficult in terms of the cares of this life that weigh you down and distract you, and the comfort that you have and the convenience that you have. And so I feel like in some ways it's a little bit less crazy to pack up everything, go to the conflict zones of the Middle East, and have yourself be confronted by choosing the gospel daily, because that is almost a less crazy place to put yourself in light of the day of the Lord. And so I think that if I was going to challenge Western listeners particularly, it would be, by all means, sell everything you have, come to the frontier, and proclaim the gospel of the kingdom until all have heard and our Messiah returns. But also, there's plenty to be done where everyone is. And the Lord calls each to their own field and to serve in their own ways, and gives talents. The master gives talents as he discerns. And so I think that just being very sober and taking inventory of what the Lord's asked you to do. Has he asked you to cut off your hand for the kingdom? Has he asked you to sell everything and go? Has he asked you to stay in the swirl of the West that has so many distractions and so many like a satanic lullaby? Our Iranian friends will say there's plenty to struggle against, I think, in the West, in this great battle that we're fighting right now. And so I would say that would be my first challenge. And then my second challenge would be to go deep in the Word. I think I didn't realize until I came to the Middle East and had a lot of my Christian tradition challenged, maybe I'll say, in different ways. And I realized that even though I was familiar with the Word, even though I heard the Word preached, even though I've been going to Bible studies since middle school and things like that, there was so much of the Word that I did not understand, and I was not asking questions about, and that I was not engaging, particularly from maybe a Jewish understanding or rooted in the Torah, and then working from there. And so just want to challenge people in the West to don't skip those genealogies. Don't skip the law. There's so much there. And I've just been stunned by just seeing God's beautiful character in the genealogies. And I keep seeing, on Instagram and on TikTok and all of these places, they'll have Christians who are reaching out over these profoundly evil platforms in a lot of ways. And there's this common Christian TikTok where they're like, when I get to Leviticus in my Bible reading, and they're just like, like so boring. And it breaks my heart each time. I'm like, no, Leviticus is amazing. Please don't just write it off. And so go deep in the word, and even go for biblical languages. Just keep on going. Keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And the Lord is going to make that your foundation. And it's such a firm foundation for being able to hold on to the hope that we have in the coming kingdom.
Yeah, I think, just piggybacking off of what Devon said, to remove the firewall from, the soccer moms and the crazies that go abroad, and in two ways. I would say first, Sermon on the Mount, because if you are, it doesn't matter who you are, where you live, what you do, if your internal life, and I'm like preaching to myself, if your internal life is living in violation to the Sermon on the Mount, I think we're at risk of standing before him in that day and him going, I never knew you. You were never changed on the inside. And you can therefore be faithful to the Lord anywhere. Your kitchen sink in Iowa or Istanbul or the far reaches of India or wherever, you could be faithful to the Lord. And in doing so, pursue the eternal purposes of God, which are make disciples of everybody everywhere. And it's so much simpler than I think that we've made it, because I would really encourage people to go through the book of Acts and just circle every time the word disciple is used, or with Jesus. There were so many people who were called disciples way before we would ever, in our philosophies, think that they're being discipled. And that could be, again, at a Starbucks. It could be in Sri Lanka. At the end of the day, I don't think the Lord really cares where you are. I think if you just have to be obedient to He has one plan and one purpose for mankind through eternity and in redemptive history. And at some point, the window of mercy is going to close, and he's going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and we're going into the next age. Ask the Lord. There's probably a really simple starting point. Or if you're thinking, wow, all I'm doing here is I have my one buddy that I'm going through the Bible with. That is no small thing. That's a huge thing. So the Lord has a way of calling us to this gnarly standard of if you put your hand to the plow and look back, you can go home. You're not worthy of me. And it is so much more accessible than we tend to think. And even, he's going to remember every time you give somebody a cup of water in his name. The small things really matter to him. So I would just want to close and say I hope that y'all feel the encouragement of the Lord to do very hard, arduous, costly things. But there's such a grace. This sounds so Christianese, but truly there's such a grace when you're abiding in the vine. It makes difficult things easier. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, Devon, Stephanie, amazing. We are so grateful for your time today, and listeners, we hope that you've been provoked and deeply encouraged by what you've heard from some others that are not in the Dudes Club, but still have the same heart and desire to preach and know and understand and live their lives for this gospel of the kingdom, this Jewish apocalyptic story, narrative, this framework, and to actually set their heart on the return of Jesus and live for the age to come. I mean, as I've said so often, that really this is the only appropriate response to this kind of message, which is to give everything for it and to really lay your life on the line and realize that God sees the heart and you can't just fake it. But this really is a message that demands all. And so it's been amazing to have both of you on today with us, sharing how the Lord has affected your lives. And we hope that listeners, it's been provoking and encouraging to you as well. So, John and Bill, great to be with you guys again today. Listeners, thanks again for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless and Maranatha.
Maranatha.
Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.